Jane Eyre is a novel written by Charlotte Brontë in 1847. The novel follows the story of Jane, a seemingly plain and simple girl as she battles through life's struggles. Jane has many obstacles in her life: her cruel and abusive Aunt Reed, the grim conditions at Lowood School, her love for Rochester and Rochester's marriage to Bertha. However, Jane overcomes these obstacles through her determination, sharp wit and courage. The novel ends with Jane married to Rochester with children of their own. The main issues which form the keystone of the book are women's rights and the preservation of women's rights. The book is in the possession of a feminine language and is written from Jane Eyre's own mouth. Jane Eyre is one of the most crucial books which were written via adhering to Romanticist movement. It has not lost its popularity for years and it is still read and appreciated by the readers. Jane is a little girl who has lost her both parents one after another and begins to live at her uncle's house after the loss of her family upon her mother's last will. Yet, her uncle has also passed away in a short time after her settling in her uncle's house. Her uncle has a wife and 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. All of them hate Jane and treat her unfairly. After her uncle's death, Jane Eyre becomes in need of the mercy of her aunt and her cousins. The only person who loves Jane and watches her over even for a bit is the maid, Bessie. Yet, Bessie's love is pale in comparison with the hatred of her aunt and her cousins. When Jane turns 10, her aunt decides to send her to a boarding school. The school that Jane is to attend is Lowood School, where serves the children of poor families and is a foundation school. Yet, despite everything, Jane is content that she will get rid of this house where she is mistreated. Jane spends 8 fine years in Lowood School in spite of the difficulties she encounters with. She teaches in the school in the last 2 years. After these 8 years, she decides that she must leave the school and she puts an advert in the newspaper for the families who search for governesses. Her advert is replied by a lady named Mrs. Fairfax who lives in a place called Thornfield. She is supposed to govern a 9-year-old girl. She immediately accepts this offer and she takes the road to Thornfield. As she arrives to Thornfield Hall, she meets Mrs. Fairfax, who is an elderly and amiable woman. Mrs. Fairfax is the housekeeper of Thornfield Hall. The owner of the house is a gentleman named Mr. Rochester, but Jane cannot have the chance to meet Mr. Rochester for he travels a lot. The little girl whom she will govern is a petite, lovely girl named Adele. Although her English is poor due to the fact that she was born in France, Jane has been taught in French in Lowood, and she does not have any difficulty to communicate with Adele. They get on well with Adele and Jane teaches her a lot of things in a short period. She loves Mrs. Fairfax as well. Yet, Mr. Rochester, the owner of the house, has not stopped by the house for all this time that she spends in Thornfield. Afterwards, she has an opportunity to meet Mr. Rochester by coincidence, yet, she is unaware of how this coincidence would change the flow of her life. Jane Eyre deals extensively with conflicting themes of independence and service. Jane was an unloved orphan for much of her life and, in order to leave Lowood, must find employment. Her gender, however, prevents her from experiencing total independence. Still, her employment at Thornfield affords her social mobility, as a governess since she has access to the aristocracy, Mr. Rochester. Her evolution as a character is greatly influenced by religion, the supernatural, hearing things, premonitions, ghosts, etc., and her navigation of the extremes of passionate feeling versus cold judgment. Jane Eyre was initially published under the pseudonym Currer Bell, because Charlotte Brontë wanted to ensure that the reception of her work would not be tainted by perceptions of her own gender. Within the novel we see Jane take similar steps to distance herself from the oppressive patriarchal structures of 19th-century England. Jane demands respect, and her dialogue with Mr. Rochester demonstrates her belief that she and he should be considered equals. Jane Eyre shows gender inequality through different characters. Jane is confined to the Red Room merely because of her being a girl, and the same goes for Bertha Mason because she depends on Rochester. It shows that the Victorian era's idea about femininity was still based on the deprioritization of gender roles. For example, St. John is free to select any career, while on the other hand, Jane could not choose her career due to her gender. However, she becomes slightly independent by the end when she visits Rochester to accept his previous proposal. Throughout the novel, Jane seeks to develop her own identity, and to become an independent woman during a time when women were expected to rely on men. Orphaned at a young age, Jane was forced to become independent early on, and accepting the position at Thornfield was an important step forward in achieving further independence as an adult. In a novel with a central romantic plot, it should come as no surprise that love and passion are primary themes of the text. Jane lives a passionate life, and this theme is connected to the theme of independence because her passion leads her to eschew certain societal standards or customs in pursuit of her own independence. The value Jane places on passion can also be seen with the differences between her two suitors. The novel shows the theme of love and marriage through the character of Jane, St. John, Mr. Rochester, and Bertha. Although St. John tells her that he is ready to marry her, she does not love him. She confesses her love for Mr. Rochester, who is already married to Bertha Mason, a mentally ill person, who has become a burden in his life, causing frustration and fear. Ultimately, when Bertha Mason commits suicide, Jane responds to Rochester's proposal, and both of them ready for marriage. Jane Eyre, the novel, shows the theme of the family role through Jane, for she is left alone in this world to fend off herself. Although she becomes independent at quite an early age, it comes at a price that she has to rely on Miss Temple and Mrs. Fairfax instead of her parents. When it comes to her relations, she finds that even relatives do not treat a lonely relation fairly. The example of St. John and Mrs. Reed are cases in point that she has to return to Miss Temple to demonstrate her love. Because of that situation, she has to spurn Rochester's offer to verify his genuineness instead of going for marriage with him in one go. In the case of having a family, she would not have to take too many troubles. Jane Eyre learns that religion plays an important role in a person's social life when she meets Mr. Brocklehurst, but she also learns that this evangelicalism has been adopted to facilitate social superiority, for it is very much couched in hypocrisy. She sees that Mr. Brocklehurst uses the funds of the children for himself and yet mistreats them. She, then, meets Helen Burns, whose tolerance surpasses the clergy, while St. John shows piety and virtuosity to win her. However, she chooses Mr. Rochester to show her own loving side. The theme of social status emerges quite early and often peeps through different strands in the novel when Jane Eyre has to go through the ordeal of attending boarding school. Although Mr. Reed is her uncle, yet she becomes a butt of their ridicule only because of her social status. She sees that although Mr. Rochester is a reasonable man, he marries Bertha only because she belongs to an aristocratic family. And he suffers for it, too. Later, when she finds a niche for herself in society, the same Rochester becomes very sincere and leans toward her. However, she finds sincerity in him, giving him a second chance, and accepts his proposal, though belatedly. Jane Eyre shows the thematic strand of Gothic elements such as through the manor of Thornfield, which is not only mysterious but also very bizarre. Bertha Mason's behavior, too, becomes strangely mysterious in such an atmosphere where the supernatural rules the roost, or at least seems so. When Rochester is left alone after the suicide of Bertha, he, too, seems to have something Gothic in him. One of the significant themes of the class struggle emerges from the character of Jane and her interaction with her relations, Mr. Reed, and his family. She stays with them as a working hand as long as she is poor, with attendant issues of loneliness and depression. However, as soon as she becomes independent, her significance with her relations improves. She not only becomes independent but also marries a gentleman, Mr. Rochester. Self-discovery or self-knowledge that is also called Bildungsroman is also a significant strand as it runs throughout the novel. Jane witnesses this transformation coming gradually to her after she lives with Mr. Reed and then leaves the family for a better prospectus after she discovers that she can survive and improve her life. She, then, does not respond to St. John's overtures, replying to him that she doesn't love him. With courage and for love, she chooses Mr. Rochester, with whom she thinks he is equally in love. This self-discovery becomes a significant theme of the novel. Many aspects of the novel point to the thematic strand of colonialism that has been going on in the world at that time. Jane's uncle, John, who lives in Madeira, shows that he has amassed wealth for her. Mr. Rochester, too, has married Bertha Mason, a Jamaican Creole lady, while St. John is ready to set sail for India, an English colony at that time. Jane Eyre remains a fresh read today. Young love that goes astray, everyone can relate to this scenario at any age. Betrayal and heartbreak and then redemption. Jane Eyre is a masterclass in character development, empathy, female empowerment, tragedy, love, and the intricacies of fate's web.